I'll try to make a quick summary of the day. The day started with Lawrence word of the day, enunciation. Lawrence said that enunciation is is a tool to articulate new cultural meanings, and said imagining enunciation as a survival strategy, a negotiation process, and a tool to regain the power. So she mentioned places as imaginary conceptual places, also to circulating negotiations among these conceptual places is important. And the first panel was enlarging spaces. Bats from Cairo started with their experiences. After spring, Arab Spring, I think the freedom somehow came to the public spaces, and passages as they started using passages as a network in public space, rethinking city as back streets and passages, but not the main streets, were the highlights of her talk. Independent spaces not tolerate on the streets level was an interesting example of the state, the conditions, but they were taking place in the first floors. But their trial to get the independent into the street level was also banned somehow, but they always created other ways of continuing and making public spaces open to public, really, and creating spaces. And for those, they found always interesting other ways. So there is always other solutions we learned from their experiences. And the collaborating with the locals and the business and things helped them. And rooftops, another interesting example of being creative in creating public spaces. Tamara started her words with saying that public space is getting smaller and smaller, and the reason was actually by the commercialization and tourism. And in one case, I mean, in Egypt case, the state terror, I would say, was the reason to narrow down the public spaces. But in Ljubljana, which is another example, but this time the commercialization was the reason. So tourism gave some examples about how tourism harmed the culture in general, forcing it to be in different ways. And talked about two squads, and she said that they took the management of old power plant, and which is a gentrified place, as far as I understand. And it is a good example also that because I know that they are an association and they are invited to the management of the public space. That's a good case in a sense. And they gave the examples of how they connected, how they try to connect space with the neighborhood, and gave the parking lot example. And festival helped them to realize all these activities. So she mentioned the festival as a cultural space, and that squads, two squads, but one is the bike factory, rock factory, have their own. The squads are interesting because they have their own management ways, kind of maybe the different democratical experiences. So these are important also for the public experiences in the public spaces. So we can, learn from these experiences as well. And she mentioned that how the spaces serve to immigrants. The autonomy of the spaces disturbed the authorities. So that was still another problem. And city wanted to take over the control, and she mentioned that what happens continuously. Tanya mentioned two keywords of EU: well-being and development. These are also the keywords used by authorities to create orderly, clean, quiet spaces. But from yesterday's talk, not to hear the noises of the periphery, but the power of the center comes into the issue into the picture again. Again, the rock fabric kind of in a process of gentrification, as far as I understand. Of course, forgive me for all my misunderstandings, possible. Again, this buzzword creative industry is getting into the account here too. So development is an ideological category, she said. And mentioned the clash of desires of the money owners or desire of the political alternatives. And one more important thing, these converted industrial places are actually losing the histories of themselves. So the capitalism or neoliberalism continuously actually writing its own story, regardless the original story of the places. And Alberto said, okay, seeing the trees, but let's see the forest, and made a kind of summary and he said occupation of public spaces by private businesses, also changing the cultural identity. So he mentioned that cultural commons are also being privatized in this by businesses. Access to private spaces and its economical use. He mentioned about this commercialization of the private places like homes. And no place for social cohesion, he said. He gave a good example that equity, and reality, less time to spend on commons and political issues, he said. And Ivor from the audience pointed out that's usage of the space and place, which was an important intervention, I guess. And another audience mentioned about the level of the privatization. So less private, more private. And the second panel was, I'll try to be more fast. Design-enabled, Francesco talked about design-enabled innovation. The value of, he said everything has a price, but the value of the cultural efforts, he questioned. Replicability, repeatability in other locations, and to the design part of this approach. And city sizes, smaller cities, he said that bigger percentage of the population. So maybe we should focus on that smaller cities and design there. What differentiates cities? How can we carry successful project in other cities, respecting the differences? And Henry Mutation, Isabel Stranger's sentence he took, and he said, tell me where you live, I will tell you what story you are building, and made an artistic intervention about that housing a place. And the narrative of simplifying, reducing the place without sacrificing the space. He experienced through their own artistic work. And Javier mentioned Human Festival. Like Tamara mentioned before, Javier talked about their festival and as a narrative itself, or the tool for creating narratives for and about human rights, social problems, as well as a festival as a platform for education, and also providing tools for disadvantaged people and of the city. Third panel was ASEAN perspective. Chema started where and how and who produced the culture was the question. And the highlights of the chapters, I'll repeat the words. Reactivation, about the public space. Reactivation, instead of constructing, activating spaces. Engagement, process, and revisiting were the keyword I'm more interested much. And Chuan, space, creativity, and local knowledge. He focused on always the locality and local knowledge and the heritage. And he brought this as a difference approach between European and maybe Asian. He mentioned about the business model, and that differs among, should differs among the spaces, should be grassrooted, and integration of the heritage and development should be the main forces of their business model. And again, emphasis on locality and local knowledge. And he finalized his words with more effort should be paid to eliminate the project justice among the cultural actors from different cultures, he said. And Raphael's mapping creativity, he said logical, he pointed out that logical and geographical mappings, creativity can be different, can have different usage. Comparison of creative industries between Spain, Italy, UK, and other words of the part was his main focus from the perspective of business, employment, economy, and finally, John, collaborative methodologies for designing public spaces. You just heard before me, so that's all.
Thank you. Well, we have 3/4 of an hour more, I think, right? Is that it? 3/4 of an hour more? Yes?
Yeah.
Right. Well, eight brief reflections on culture and space I'd like to share with you. 1, space is not neutral. 2, space is not indifferent. 3, space is not only context, it is a resource in itself. 4, creativity as a resource and space as context and agency condition each other mutually and allow for the advancement of dynamics built on symbolic information exchange that affect aesthetic, emotional, and spiritual dimensions of individuals and collectives. 5, the complex interactions between space and the cultural and creative processes that take place in them are central to cultural policies and strategies that aim at social and economic exchange. 6, cultural spaces could be understood or should be understood as interfaces between individual creative capacities and their potential effects on change. 7, on a more analytical level, cultural spaces can be approached as a threefold supplier to creative processes. First, as providers of resources. Second, as providers of semiotic functions. And third, as providers of practical or operational functions. And finally, 8, spaces, their configuration and management models have always been in the center of cultural processes. Each era needs to reformulate them according to the specific modes, practices, and challenges of cultural production, distribution, and consumption. Thank you. Good lunch.